Good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking time. I know you're busy, you're in session. I really appreciate it for joining us here on our Marcys Law interview series, Why We Do What We Do. You are such a friend of Marcys Law and have been since the beginning, since we went into Pennsylvania. So thank you so much for your advocacy, not just for Marcys Law, but for what you do for victims and what you've done your whole entire career. Just by way of introduction, your stellar career as a state rep since you've been there. This is your 6th term, right? Mm-hmm. Well, you are the kind of legislator that I think everyone in America wants to see today. And just by virtue of the awards that you've won, the prize for civility in public life in Pennsylvania.
Civility in politics, the oxymoron.
Yeah, exactly. And the Harrisburg Regional Chamber also recognized you as the Government Leader of the Year. And we know you fondly as the primary sponsor of Marcys Law and one of our leading voices and advocates, and you continue to be. So when we went into Pennsylvania, I have to tell you, we go into different states around the country, as you know, to get Marcys Law passed as constitutional amendments. And what we do is we talk to different stakeholders and people in the victims advocacy community, the law enforcement community, criminal justice community in general. And one of the names that kept coming up every time we talked to people in groups in Pennsylvania was Sheryl Delozier. If you want to get this thing passed, if you want to talk to people who are really going to be involved in victims' rights, you need to talk to State Rep Sheryl Delozier. So of course we took everybody's unanimous recommendations, and that's how we tracked you down. So
yeah, thank you. Well, that was very nice. I appreciate that. That it's nice to hear that your work, people are aware of something that's important to you and what you advocate for.
Yeah, well, thankfully they were all right. They were all correct in their assessment of you and your advocacy and all of your contacts in this field, which started a long time ago when you were a volunteer. Tell us a little bit about when you got your first grown-up job, as you talked to me about it, and you saw that there was a certain portion of your paycheck that you could take out and designate to different causes or organizations.
Sure. That was actually my first taste of, like I said, adulthood in coming out to Harrisburg and getting my grown-up job for the first time with the State Auditor General's office. And the ability for us with the Pennsylvania state government is a SECA campaign, and that allows you to deduct from your paycheck certain dollars. You could do $5, you could do $100, whatever you were able to do, and devote it to a particular United Way cause. And at the time, I had some expenses, and obviously being my first job, certainly wasn't, rolling in a big paycheck or anything like that. So the dollars weren't really there for me to be able to divert some of those to a charity that I felt strongly about. But moving out to Harrisburg, I was on my own, and I had time. And so what I decided to do was seek out criminal justice and victims have been 2 of my passions within the legislature. And at that time, in understanding what our local YWCA did in dealing with a rape crisis and domestic violence. So they counseled on both of those issues. They stood up for women and children and victims of either of those issues. So what we needed to do, or what they needed, I called them and said, well, how can I help? I don't have a couple dollars to give you, but I have 2 hands and mind and body. I'm glad to do that. So as we all know with our nonprofits, they need both. And so that worked out, and they told me about being trained. So I had to go down and go through a pretty extensive training twice a week, and would get a couple hours in and be there and learn about the victims, learn about what they need to move from being a victim to being a survivor, and understand what folks are going through at that time and the advocacy that they need. And that just started the pathway, but certainly opened my eyes to so many other parts of the victim and what they all have to go through, the emotional, the physical, the mental, the family support that they may or may not have, those types of things. And it was a pretty amazing experience. And then I continued to do that for a number of years.
So you were in your 20s at the time.
Yeah.
And And
I remember all the way back then.
yeah, and your training was a couple of nights a week and a few hours a night, just to be trained for it. So this wasn't
Right.
just something you just decided to sign up for. This was
Right.
this was a big time commitment.
Right, they wanted you to be prepared. They wanted you to understand what a victim's mental state was, what the resources we had, and how we could direct them in the best possible way to get the counseling that any victim of crime needs to have, in the sense that so many times as a victim, they feel that it was their fault. They feel domestic violence is their fault. They did something wrong. Well, they didn't do something wrong. Someone else use them and abuse them that's supposed to love them. And that's not doing something wrong, that's the other person's issues. And the same thing with a rape, in the sense that people feel that guilt. People feel that, oh, well, I should have fought harder, I should have done this, or I should have done that, or I shouldn't have walked down that street, or whatever the situation. And a lot of that mental discussion and counseling is to bring them back to the realization that as a victim, it's nothing you did. It was somebody else's actions that caused you to be that victim.
Yeah, and that's what you and I discussed is that when victims get put into the criminal justice system, it's not by their own choice.
Right.
And it's typically the only time that they're hopefully ever involved in the system, and it's so foreign. And so any friendly voice or any person that they can have counsel them along the way, especially right at the very beginning, which is where you would typically come into contact with victims.
Yeah.
Now, after your training was complete, that just was really the beginning, because then you worked every Wednesday night. You were saying once a week, every Wednesday night, and you were on call for 2 hours every Wednesday night. And can you tell us what that meant by being on call? It wasn't just answering the phone.
Oh no, absolutely. And it was 6 p.m. to 8 a.m. So it was overnight. So it was actually each Wednesday night, it would be 14 hours, because it was that overnight period that we were on call, and they would have us volunteers be there to do that. And at the time, there were two ways of doing it. If a call came in the hotline, the YW would get the call and they would forward it to our house. And then we would be able to talk to the person. And we, because the YW is open 24/7, so that the switchboard and the person that answers the phone, the receptionist, is there, because it's an emergency situation. And so I would either get a phone call, and really, in many times, these were folks that were reaching out for help, and they just wanted to be heard. Many times in the conversations, I can, say that I didn't talk much. I was certainly just that ear. Many times folks feel that they can open up and vent to someone they don't see or know, that it's much different to call their neighbor, because then they have to see their neighbor the next day. Talking to a person on a hotline and asking for advice, it's not somebody they know, but it's somebody that they know deals with these certain types of issues. And so they have a little bit better of a comfort level in venting out all of the details. But either that, or we would get called out if it was a domestic violence situation and someone was brought to the hospital, and or a rape for the rape kit. And so we would get called out to the hospital over whatever time, and most likely it was not, it was, a lot of times early mornings. And I say that, in 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, so it was never a set time, certainly. And it was, as this happens, it's not something that happens on a schedule. So those of us that were on the call either would take the call from the individual or we'd get the phone call from the YW, and they'd say, can you go to such and such Harrisburg Hospital, that we have a victim that's there that's been called in. And that was where I would walk them through and be that advocate for them. As we have talked about, the ability for our local law enforcement and our ability to educate the mentality of what a victim is. And certainly they knew what a victim was, but the understanding of what they are going through at that particular point in time, a lot of the sensitivity training, a lot of the education on what a rape kit victim or a rape victim endures just to collect a rape kit. It is necessary part of the process. And as you know, from the prosecution point of view, you need that evidence. You need that DNA. You need the pictures to be taken. But as a victim, you've already been brutally assaulted against your will. And now all of a sudden you have to be in this hospital and once again go through a very personal, intimate exam and get in and evidence gathering. So you have to be there and talk them through why you're doing what you're doing, why you need to protect yourself. I mean, one of the issues that came up, especially when I was doing it, we knew a lot about the AIDS virus, but not a lot. And so this, it was in the 90s that I was doing this, and so a lot less was known, a lot less people survived AIDS. But when you had that intimate contact as a rape, some of the first conversations are, well, did I contract AIDS through that? And we as advocates, honestly, and people kind of don't understand as to the fact that we would counsel them not to get an AIDS test that night. Mainly because the ability, everything that was taken that night was in the court hearing. And you know as well as I do how much victim blaming happens within our court system. And if someone came out positive with an AIDS test, it had nothing to do with the rape. Because as medicine has shown, that had to do with something prior to. Counseling that person to understand that yes, absolutely, we want you to be safe. Yes, if you want to have that information, do that. But there are public clinics to do that. And it's something that would just protect the case and not have them blamed for something else that came apart. And so that conversation many times, was difficult because they're scared and they just want to know all the answers immediately. And so to explain to them that they should wait for that type of information was difficult. They're trying to have that capability of making their own decisions. As a victim, you didn't have a decision in what happened to you. But we as advocates were we tried to hand back little decisions back to them in the hospital. Do you want, it could be this most simplest thing. Do you want to wear this gown or this gown? And that sounds so simple, but having them make that choice that they decide what it is that they're going to. Would you like to wait in here or would you like to wait in this room over here? Small decision-making processes was kind of what we were trying to give back their power, give back their authority in what was happening to them. Because that night, everything had been taken away from them and that authority. So a lot of that was what we went through those nights, just trying to make sure that they recognized that it wasn't their fault, recognize that they as a victim can get through this and move to the survivor side of it. Obviously, that's not in their realm at that point, but down the road, it certainly would be.
Yeah, it really is interesting, the process that it takes to incrementally empower them again. Yes. At that terrible moment, at that low point where they're just so devastated and intimidated, and especially, like you said, to put it in context back in those days with AIDS and all that was unknown at the time. So the height of concern and just how sensitive every one of those encounters had to be for the victim and the work that you would give. And the interesting thing you talk about is what's one of your skill sets that you've brought to the legislature clearly is what a good listener you are. And that
it does help.
Well, it's like my mom used to say to my brothers and me that God gave you one mouth and two ears and use them accordingly.
Exactly.
You and I talked a little bit about some of the stories that you remember. Sometimes you would be in the hospital waiting room with a victim for hours, and the sensitive situation that they were in as compared to every other person that was in a waiting room or the emergency room. Mm-hmm. And you would be the only person that they could speak to. Mm-hmm. And the only shoulder that they could put their hands on, and that must have been very difficult for you as you had to wait and explain to them that evidence collection was going to happen.
Right. It was, and that was actually usually the most stressful time because they, as a victim, are there and they really just want to go home. They really just want to go take a shower. They really just want to just put this behind them. And there's absolutely nothing wrong. And if you can totally empathize with the fact of wanting to do all of those things. Unfortunately, again, back when I was doing this in the 90s, there was no such elevation of recognition to the fact that this person was going through a very, very emotional, very just personal situation, and not minimizing anyone else running to the ER. Obviously, they all have their emergencies, but the ability for us to move into a private room to wait. At the time, it was set up that the ER doctors would have to collect the evidence in the rape kit, and the ability for us to recognize that we need to do something better for our victims. And that came around, and we had talked about, safe nurses, and giving them the authority to collect the evidence, and not taking an ER doctor away from a very busy emergency room. And many times they had to slot these victims in when they could get to them. They knew they weren't going anywhere, to be perfectly honest, but the ER doctors were busy, with a car accident or something that, somebody that life or death in the fact of why they're in the emergency room. So obviously they took those first. But having the safe nurses and having the ability to have those people come in and just totally dedicate themselves to this victim, I think was a huge step over the years, and something that transpired while I was a victim's advocate. It wasn't there when I first started, but it was very, very needed, and something that was a good move public policy wise, and the ability. And I will say, just gender wise, most of the nurses typically were women versus the doctors, and this has changed and evolved since then, thank goodness. We have men and women doing both now, but at the time, very much predominantly, it would have been a male doctor coming in to gather the evidence and basically doing a gynecological exam. And at the time of after someone being raped, it was just a very awkward and very personal situation that they really just added to the trauma of the night. So the ability to switch that over and have a nurse that is directly to tend to them and gather the evidence in a quiet, removed room was a very good policy change, and something that I saw evolve while I was there.
Yeah, it shows how far we've come to
Yes.
with training and education in that field, to have, like you refer to them as safe nurses. It's an acronym for sexual assault forensic examiners, and the fact that they are now present in more settings and in children's advocacy centers, quite frankly, all around the country too. And it's so helpful for the victim to be able to avail themselves of that with a victim witness advocate who will be with them and be able to walk them through the process, and it becomes a little bit less intimidating.
They see people on their side. They see people, and that means a lot to someone who, especially if they don't have the family support. Sometimes, people had people with them, which was beneficial to them, obviously, that comfort level. But many, many times they were there alone.
Yes, and by virtue of the fact that they've been victimized, when you talk about seeing people on their side, or even seeing this, it seems like just by virtue of the fact that they are there as a victim and they've been victimized, right away they think that something has been stacked against them for some reason through no fault of their own. And you did that work for about 10 years until when you first started it, you volunteered and said, I might not have that much money, but I do have a lot of time. But then you had a lot less time because you had a
Yes. So, children will do that.
So you kind of transitioned out, at least from being on call from 6 p.m. to 8 a.m. Still did some escorting and accompanying of victims, and then you decided to run for public office.
Yes.
To take your interest in policy and your expertise into the public arena, and that was about 12 years ago.
Yes.
And one of the things, obviously, that you advocated for because of your volunteer work was equity and balance in the criminal justice system. And you talked to me about how the rights that the accused enjoy are constitutional rights, where you noticed that the victims' rights, although they are in statute, were not elevated to constitutional rights, and victims did not have meaningful and enforceable constitutional rights in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania until the idea of Marcys Law.
Mhm.
And so could you tell us a little bit about what interested you in Marcys Law?
Well, that was kind of a no-brainer from my perspective when I first was speaking with those that had an interest in coming to Pennsylvania and changing the law here. The ability for us and my advocacy for criminal justice reform, for the victim's voice, for many of the bills that I would introduce were through the Judiciary Committee and dealt with the criminal justice and judiciary and justice system as a whole. So we can make common sense criminal justice changes, and Pennsylvania brought Pennsylvania forward in many different ways, and I'm proud of that work. But we can also make that balance with victims' rights and victims' voices. And I think that that's why a lot of people did come to me when we were dealing with criminal justice reform, because I brought the victim's perspective, and I will time and time again bring up where's the victim in this? Where does the victim stand in this? But the ability for us to turn that around and look at Marcys Law, with Pennsylvania not having that in their constitution. As you mentioned, it is certainly in statute. And our DAs, we have wonderful DAs across the state of Pennsylvania. Absolutely. We have hardworking who put their heart and soul on the line to defend, to get justice for victims and to be their voice in the court. But that we do have every once in a while a few that don't go that extra mile for that victim. And so that's why we needed to say, the bottom line is that, when our forefathers established the Constitution, they established this Constitution thinking that we need to have fairness and we need to have equity and we need to have balance in our judicial system. The scales of justice, they always talk about the scales of justice need to be balanced. Our forefathers did our constitutions based on those premises. And that's what Marcys Law is. Marcys Law is balancing the scales. Marcys Law is saying that a victim should be notified when there is a court hearing, that a victim should know what's happening in their court case, and a victim should have a voice and be able to say what happened to them and how this crime that was perpetrated against them is changed their life. Many times, people say, oh, get over it. It's been years. Why aren't you over this? Well, they have no idea if it was, especially if it was a violent crime, especially if they took a family member from them, especially if they, all these different types of crime, you just don't get over that. And so time and time again, people would talk about taking away the rights of the accused. Marcys Law does none of that. Marcys Law takes nothing from the accused. All it does is say that a victim has recourse. A victim should be told when their court hearings are. A victim should have that victim statement. Give the judge the ability to say in court and open court, where does the victim stand in this? They have rights and they should be in our Constitution. And that's what we fought with Marcys Law to make that Pennsylvania is not one of the minority of states that do not have victims anywhere mentioned in their Constitution. There is nowhere in Pennsylvania state Constitution that mentions the fact that those that perpetrate crime, who they perpetrate it against and what rights those folks have. So I will, as I've always said, anytime a question comes up, I'll say, well, have we talked to the victim? Did we make sure the victim is represented in this law that we're going to pass? Marcys Law was the same thing. I think personally, it goes all the way back to the folks that established our first Constitution, and we're just continuing that same message. We need balance in our judicial system and balance for the victims of crime in our state. And that's why I became very passionate about it, because it absolutely rang true. And it absolutely was something that Pennsylvania needed. And not only was I passionate about the victim's voice long ago, this just encapsulated what it was that our victims needed here in Pennsylvania. And I was glad to work with many people in our state to get it done. My name was on the bill that went through, and being a constitutional amendment, it had to go through 2 sessions, exactly the same in Pennsylvania, and before it went to the voters. So there were a lot of folks. I had partners over in the Senate that worked a bill the first session. I worked the House bill, through the second session. So over 4 years of work went into making sure, because our terms are 2 years, and making sure that the ability for this to go to the voters was accomplished, and it was. And over 74% of our voters supported it, and said yes, that victims deserved the right to have their voice heard in our state constitution.
Yeah, and you make a really good point, and I'm glad you talked about sometimes it's tough to talk about it, the procedural part of it, but the fact that it has to get through 2 legislative cycles and then go to the voters. It's tough to amend a constitution, and
it should be. It should be.
There's a reason for that, exactly, because you do need broad consensus, and you need buy-in, not just from the House and not just from the Senate, but from the electorate and the people. Right. Like you said, which goes right back to the intentions of our forefathers. And your approach to criminal justice reform, people talk about criminal justice reform a lot these days, and it's been your position that criminal justice reform does not mean just the accused or just the defendant, but the victims need to be part of criminal justice reform. And that's one of the things that drove you to be such an incredible advocate for Marcys Law, because if we're going to talk about criminal justice reform, let's talk about elevating victims' rights to constitutional rights. You make another great point too, which is what comes up in a lot of different states, especially at the outset when we start to talk about Marcys Law. Some people will talk about constitutional rights as if they're a zero-sum game and say, well, if you're going to be giving constitutional rights to victims, what is going to happen to defendants' constitutional rights? And the answer is nothing happens to defendants' constitutional rights. They stay in the Constitution just as secured as victims' rights should be as well. And you really walk the walk when it comes to, I really think you take a holistic approach to criminal justice reform and criminal justice issues, you as a state representative. In fact, not just your advocacy on behalf of victims stood out when I started to talk to you, but what actually you've done for defendants and the Clean Slate Act. If you could just tell us a little bit about what you've done with that. And there's another bill that you just got, the governor, you got all bipartisan support once again for both of these bills that ensure rights for defendants. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. The ability for us, certainly criminal justice reform is kind of a buzzword right now, and certainly one that people, in my opinion, define differently as to what that actually means. From the perspective of what I have worked, criminal justice reform is common sense changes to our judicial system, and always having the victim as a part of that. And that goes to the issue of the fact that, I say about criminal justice reform, we've all made mistakes. Nobody, if I'm in a room of people and I say not one person in this room could probably honestly say they've never made a mistake. And the ability for certainly some are more serious than others, absolutely. And we need to have people that commit heinous crimes kept in jail, kept in prison, and serve their time and serve their penalty. But most people will go into our prison system. Most people will go into our local county jail system. They are coming back into our communities. They are not staying in for a life sentence or for 25 to 30 years of their lives. They're going in for 3 to 5. They're going in for shorter terms. So the ability for us to turn that around and say, when those folks come back into our community, we don't want them to go back into our prison system. We don't want them. It costs $40,000 a head in our prison system, for our state system, correctional system. So, find fiscally prudent individuals can see the math problem here. I would rather have someone come out of prison and become a active community participant in their families, in our communities, paying taxes, getting a job, and all of those. So Clean Slate is right up that alley. Many times people came out, and one of their biggest hurdles after they've served their time and paid their penalties was finding jobs and finding housing. Many times folks made a stupid mistake when they were 19, 20 years old, and now they're a parent, and they're a spouse, and they're needing to find good housing, but because they have a record, they are not any record. And we were dealing with misdemeanors and things that, like I said, could be very stupid mistakes that they made. But the ability that it penalized them 10 years later without any ability, any other interaction with the law. So we went about clean slate in the same common sense way that I felt for Marcys Law. People deserve a second chance when they have made a mistake, paid their dues, and they move on. And our community should help to do that. We passed the clean slate law, basically saying that if someone has committed a crime, found guilty of that crime, and they have gone 10 years without any other interaction, it was a one blip on the screen, that their record would be sealed. And that's a difference from expungement. It's not going away. It's not, law enforcement, if something would happen down the road, law enforcement and the courts would still have access to the fact that this person's past record. But when a company does a search for past records, you do not come up. When a landlord does a search for past records, it does not come up. And we've worked very hard with, this was kind of a great example of all three branches of government working together well. The governor signed the bill, the legislature passed the bill, the governor signed the bill, and our judicial branch of government and courts developed the computer system to make this happen. It is an automatic sealing of records. And most recently we did an update. I always think that anytime a bill gets passed, we need to step back and evaluate where changes should need to be happening. Is it accomplishing what needs to be accomplished? One of the issues, and this was House Bill 440 that just passed this session, the ability for them to recognize. One of the things that I was very, very adamant about with Clean Slate was that no one will retain or have the option of allowing for Clean Slate to happen to their record if they hadn't paid their restitution to the victim. Very few times do our victims get the restitution that they want or that they are deserved because it was awarded by the court. Very, very less than 10% ever see a dime. And the ability to say, in order to you want to have a clean slate, you want to have your record sealed, you will make sure that your restitution is paid. One of the things we also did in Clean Slate was also fines and fees. And what we found was that, we're talking about getting jobs, we're talking about getting higher pay, a job possibly without a record once it's sealed. The ability for us to say that you have to have made a good faith effort to try and pay your fees and fines. If this sealing would allow you to move on and get a better job, to pay your fines and fees, you have to work with the system and be able to do it, but it won't prevent you from getting a clean slate and being able to move forward to pay. But those court fines and fees are still required to be continually paid, but it won't prohibit you from having a clean slate. But the one thing that I said time and time again is we can deal with the fines and fees. Many of those are at the county level. And everything paying that what is owed, but we will not do a clean slate. You will not be eligible unless the victim has been made whole. And so that's what I talk about, common sense balance. Yes, we recognize someone's made a mistake and needs to move forward, but we're also going to recognize that you're going to make your victim whole according to the court system before you will even get the thought of having the benefit of a clean slate. So again, that was just kind of an example of being able to balance the system, keeping in mind the victim and making them whole before someone would get a benefit of a law being passed on their behalf.
Yeah, well, thank you, because that piece of legislation is very reflective of your approach, your even-handed approach, because you don't just fight for victims, and your fierce advocacy for victims is, like we said in the very beginning, is known throughout the Commonwealth, not just in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, not just in your district, but you do it in a sense, in a way that you fight not just for victims, but more broadly for justice. Mm-hmm. And we appreciate that. And what it does is it just gives you more and more credibility as you fight for victims and as you fight for Marcys Law. We really appreciate it. And also your approach in general, which is it's clear why you received the prize for civility in public.
Well, I have good partners, Jordan Harris in Philadelphia and many others. He's been my teammate here in the House, and we've worked well together, and it's been quite a ride, and we've become friends over the years. So we'll have those conversations and say, you can't, our voting records are very different, but on criminal justice, we agree. So.
Yeah, and I know you guys are in session
Yes.
today, and so I know you have to roll. So I just wanted to thank you so much again.
Oh, thank you.
For your time today and for all of the great work you do for the criminal justice system in general, to keep it balanced and to keep it equitable. Your fight for victims and specifically for Marcys Law.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's an honor to do so, and I will continue.
Thanks so much, Sheryl. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye. See ya.